So in all those years of research about the phenomenology of experience, what do you say about the experience of hypnosis? What should the average clinician understand about the experience of hypnosis? What is the, if you can draw out some of the clinical implications of your research, that would be useful.
All right, let me draw out some of the clinical implications by saying I think there is an enormous difference between a clinician investigating hypnosis in the clinical setting and an experimenter investigating hypnosis in the laboratory setting. And there's a sort of controversy existing in the literature as to whether or not everyone's susceptible or not, and I think that's totally misleading. I think one doesn't ask that question, but in the clinical setting, I think you can actually achieve response to the suggestion by virtue of the influence of the clinician in question. In the laboratory setting, I don't think you get much response by virtue of the influence of the experimenter in that setting. You can see the link back to transference. I think the relationship component in the clinical setting works to make hypnosis a much more effective tool than you would anticipate given what happens in the experimental setting. So I'm totally at home and in harmony with profound individual differences in susceptibility in the laboratory setting, and totally at home and in harmony with how many people really look to be susceptible in the clinical setting. That indicates to me that the relationship component of clinical settings is a very important factor in determining behavioural outcomes.
So when a clinician is being given mixed advice, some people would say you should routinely do hypnotic susceptibility testing, like using the Stanford scale or even Spiegel's eye roll test, and others who would say that the tests really don't have much clinical predictive validity. Where are you on that?
I think that question is a furphy. I think in a sense,
okay.
Furphy means I think it's very misleading.
Yeah.
I think in a sense, you've got to be careful that you don't advise the clinicians on the basis of what happens in the laboratory, as much as you've got to be careful to advise the laboratory investigator what happens in clinician. And this issue of simply saying, well, I'm an experimenter, I'm a laboratory investigator, you should routinely test for susceptibility. I think in the clinical context, with all its complexities, if it's important to know how responsive the person is on tests like the Stanford scale or other scales, then by all means use it. But I can think of some settings in which it isn't, and why use it just because the experimentalists say you should? And I would make the same point on the other side. And this business about, well, are we all susceptible or are we not, is so isolationist in singling out the simplicity of what's going on. And the distinction between clinical and experimental hypnosis is really explained by the complexity of what goes on.
Well, one of the few things in the field that everybody agrees on are the differences in susceptibility.
Yes.
What people argue about is the meaning of that. What is the meaning of that?
I'm very much of the model that, and it of course slots in more generally to why do you think we behave in the way that we do? And Magnuson has now passed away, but I think his contribution in terms of, Michel, I think his contribution in terms of how much is what we do determined by the situations we're in, and how much we determine by the traits of our personality. I think situations have an enormous influence, and I've just been expanding to you a situational explanation of the difference between clinical and experimental. But at the same time, I think person attributes do matter, and I think individual differences in hypnosis, if you can isolate out strongly influential relationship factors, are profoundly significant in that certain traits are compatible with hypnotic responsiveness and certain traits aren't. We know that imagery is, in a curvilinear way, we know that there's possibly a relationship between other aspects of our personality and susceptibility. And I feel most comfortable when I go in and talk to people about hypnosis. I feel most comfortable in saying to them, well, look, hypnosis is what your skills allow you to behave. Don't start talking about the power of the hypnotist. It's a skill component you have which allows you to construct situations to utilise those skills. Now that's an individual differences point of view, it's a Hilgardian point of view, and I want to expound that point of view, but don't underestimate the situational component and influence, particularly in relationship terms.
Well, Hilgard was less about situational influences and more the hypnotizability as a fixed trait sort of phenomenon that doesn't really change over time. So
it depends how you like what you're saying.
He would using the Stanford scale, test, retest, 20 years later.
What you're saying is perfectly appropriate for a laboratory investigator talking about hypnosis,
exactly right.
which Hilgard was.
He was. He literally said that the skills required to be a hypnotist are very, very minimal. That's a direct quote.
I think I agree with that, because all that's important really are the skills of the subject within the context he's reconstructed and working in. But go across to the clinical context, I think traits are important, but the clinical context is a vastly different situation to the experimental context. I think relationship components of the clinical context have elements akin to transference. I think they slot into the sorts of things I'm talking about with this woman and maybe the psychiatric nurse. And when I get a comment, well, she's not deeply somnambulistic, she hasn't got an extraordinary imaginative component, she's just got fairly intense rapport. All that is part of the mix. And I think for so often we talk in hypnosis as if someone's viewpoint when they're investigating ought to be the viewpoint of the clinician, and the clinician's viewpoint when he's being or she's being a clinician ought to be the viewpoint of the other. It doesn't work like that. Not if you're a phenomenologist.